All right. Dan, Bob, if you could join me here in my garage, that'd be great. Maybe hop on video. Bob's in a data center.
In a government leased building designed by Gensler.
Gotcha. Awesome.
My form of shameless marketing.
Love it. That's great. And Dan, what shameless marketing do you have for us today? Where are you?
Yeah, I'm sitting in a beautiful building on 1701 Rhode Island Avenue in Washington, D.C. It's a whole building WeWork. So it's a great spot.
That's great. So to newcomers who have not participated in this series before, I want to call it a couple sort of housekeeping items. If you have Q&A, we like to do it sort of on a rolling basis. So just toss them into the Q&A section and I'll work the questions in live. And then otherwise, I think we'll end up doing most of those answers live with Bob and Dan. Okay, so Bob, we'll start with you. Who are you? What's your background and what do you do today?
Well, my name is Bob Peck. I have spent about half my career in private sector real estate. I'm a lawyer by training, but strangely enough, I work in an architecture firm, Gensler, or a worldwide architecture and design and planning firm. And I lead our government and defense practice area. I have worked on Capitol Hill in the United States Senate, working on public buildings issues, and most relevant to this conversation, and also a little bit like Dan, I have been the commissioner of the Public Building Service at the General Services Administration. I did it twice, once during the Clinton administration and again during the Obama administration.
That's great. And Dan, who are you? What's your background? What are you doing these days?
Sure. So my name is Dan Mathews, and similarly to Bob, actually, I spent a long time on Capitol Hill in Congress. Grew up in this area and left Georgetown University and then went up to Capitol Hill and worked on all sorts of infrastructure issues for a long time, but landed with federal real estate. Actually, back when Bob was commissioner for the Clinton administration. So oftentimes he was testifying and we were up on the other side of that engagement. So that was always fun. And about 4 years ago, I was asked to go be the commissioner of the Public Building Service at GSA. And so I was there for just about 4 years, left in January. And I'm now head of federal sales at WeWork, helping them manage kind of the federal sales world post-COVID, or in the middle of COVID, hopefully soon post-COVID.
Yeah.
Can I say also that just sort of a hopeful sign for people, given what generally happens in Washington, Dan and I are clearly from different political parties, but the issues that we deal with are generally not partisan. And I'd like to say that Dan and I have not only been professional colleagues, but friends. I mean, I think we're a proof that some parts of the old Washington still work.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, for those attending, you know, I think it may seem unremarkable, but we have two former commissioners of the GSA here today, which is really, really cool for a variety of reasons. And I was actually hoping, if it would be all right, if you all could maybe define the scope and scale of the GSA's operation. Like, what is total square footage under management? What is just like the size of this operation?
Dan, you want to start? You got more recent data.
Yeah, happy to. So it's big. I mean, it's massive, actually. Right, about 375 million square feet is under GSA's control, and that's just GSA. There are obviously other agencies, Department of Defense, and others that have their own real estate portfolios. But GSA's portfolio is large, 375 million square feet. About half of that is government owned, and half of that is actually commercially leased. And it consists of a lot of different things. Office space is the primary function in that 375 million square feet, but you also have courthouses, border stations, so land ports of entries, a variety of laboratories, things like that, even some healthcare facilities. but the bulk of it is office space.
Is military separate? Just to be clear.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well.
Yeah. As always, it's yes and no. The military bases, like Fort Benning, Fort Bragg, where I once was, are Defense Department controlled. But when the military, when they're off of a military reservation, often in leased space, are in private sector spaces, and they're in a GSA lease. More often than not. The other thing, Dan, to note is that in the owned space, there are about, I don't know, the number is about 1,500 separate government-owned buildings. And in leases, then again, you know better than I was something like 8,000 buildings have a government lease, something.
Close to 8,000 leases right now.
Yeah. So it's huge. It's everywhere. There are even some facilities in Guam, which I made a point of never getting to.
Well, I think that part of sort of defining sort of the scope and scale of this, one of the questions that I had always had is, are federal agencies your customers? Are federal agencies sort of, hey, we want to buy this building or take this building, or are you sort of assigning space? Is it centrally managed? Is it decentrally managed? How does it work?
Well, the interesting thing is that 2 points. One, there are about 100 or so government agencies that get space from GSA, and yes, most of them cannot go out and lease space or build a building on their own. There are some exceptions, but generally for federal civilian agencies off of federal reservations, that's the case. The other point I'd make that sort of determines how GSA works is that GSA charges those agencies rent for the space that they occupy. So in essence, we'll talk a little bit about how GSA is and isn't modeled like a private sector real estate business, but to a great extent of the something like $9 billion, $10 billion that GSA spends a year, a good chunk of that money comes in from rent payments from federal agencies. It's a square foot charge, just like you'd see in the private sector.
I'm curious. I remember in our previous conversation, someone had mentioned, I can't remember if it was Bob or Dan, but one of you had mentioned that GSA actually is more or less profitable. Maybe that's not the right term, but that there is a fund that is from these collected payments that maybe you can't access, but the GSA is not sort of a money losing enterprise. Is that correct?
Yeah, that was me actually, and so just to take off of what Bob said, they collect about $10.5 billion in rent every year, but unlike private sector companies, federal government doesn't have a capital budget, so it's literally like an annual cash flow operation, and so it takes in more revenues. It has to take in more revenues than it can spend, because its ability to spend is determined by what it's taking in revenues. And so it does have a net operating income, although that is getting quite strained right now for a variety of reasons. One is this: they have a massive deferred capital liability because they generate about $2 billion in net operating income every year. So it's not bad, right? On $10.5 billion, you're generating about $2. That's been getting a little smaller. But what it doesn't show you is a massive explosion in capital liabilities in the buildings that GSA owns. So government-owned buildings, it's well over $15 billion now. In fact, they don't have a great number. It's probably quite a bit higher than that, but they just can't access that capital very easily. It's subject to appropriations from Congress. It's sort of like a revolving fund, but not really. A true revolving fund, you collect money, you're able to spend it in the government without subsequent approvals. It doesn't work that way. They have to get appropriated approval to spend that $10.5 billion they take in every year, and they don't get it. They get about $9 billion or less for the last decade, hence that giant backlog of capital expenditures.
Yeah, here's another way to think about, Congress in the 1970s had this great idea that GSA would be on this rent charging and, sort of business-like basis. And as Dan noted, but then they turned around and said, yeah, but you can't spend the money unless Congress tells you to each year. So we don't generally, GSA doesn't generally have problems getting the money that's required to make annual lease payments for that half of the portfolio that's leased. Doesn't have that much trouble getting enough money to pay the utilities, and to carpet, fix the roof if there's a leak. But that other part of it was designed to be, as Dan noted, a revolving fund, a capital fund. When you go to them and say, okay, we made $2 billion this year, that's supposed to be set aside to build new buildings or courthouses or do major renovation work. That's where Congress sort of like closed the wallet for most of the last 20 years. There aren't very many times where we've been able to get a lot of money. Finally, I just note that sometimes, like during the Great Recession, Congress gave GSA some of it from the Buildings Fund proceeds, some of it from other tax dollars, $5.5 billion, to make up some part of what had been the capital maintenance backlog deficit that Dan alluded to. But, that's getting to be a long time ago, and they haven't done it since.
So, all right. So we've established GSA is big. 375 million square feet of space, half is owned, half is leased. How many employees are in this space? And we're gonna get to essentially like the craziness that just happened, which is like everybody went home, and some of the extraordinary things that I think the U.S. federal government and particularly GSA has put in place to facilitate work and allow the government to continue running. But like, I'm really curious, how many employees, and then like, are they all at home now? Are they coming in? Like, what is the current state?
It's a great question. And so in general, using round numbers, it's about 2 million employees. So just do the rough math, right? It's not a great utilization rate. That was pre-COVID. So once COVID hits, of course, it depends on the actual function. Some federal employee functions, they never went home. Right, they were always there. Just think, a variety of operations centers that, like FEMA, for example, they were coordinating the response to the pandemic on behalf of the CDC. They never went home. They reduced the density a little bit, started doing shifts. A lot of classified work still has to happen. So, but even in those locations, they probably dropped down to below 50% occupancy level in those sort of classified settings, and they oftentimes shifted to 2 shifts or 3 shifts to split them up into different cohorts. So also everyone didn't come down with COVID if there was an outbreak and you had to quarantine them. But most office functions, they dropped down to below 10%, and I think that's still today. It depends again on the location and the function, but on the low end, it's below 10%. I think on the high end right now with Delta, it's probably 40% occupancies.
Yeah. And the government, like so many other employers, it differs by agency. You'll hear Dan and me saying this a lot. Everybody says the federal government, but like I said, there are 100 different agencies in GSA space, and they behave, as you might imagine, like different operating units in a corporation. They have different corporations. They have different styles, different missions, different ways of operating. But we started noticing back maybe 10 years ago, Dan, I don't know if I ever said this, there was a huge snowstorm in Washington. And in Washington, the federal government, when there were snowstorms, you'd wake up early in the morning and they'd decide whether the federal government people had to go to work or whether they could take leave and stay home.
Is this 96 by chance?
Yeah, no. This was like this was what was, I think, Snowzilla or whatever they called it. It was like 2011 or something. Anyway, for the first time, everybody noticed that while a lot of federal workers, I think there are like 300,000 of them in the DC area, stayed home, the email traffic, suddenly everybody realized, well, most work gets done by email. The government really didn't shut down like it used to on snow days. Lots of stuff was getting done. That was some of the impetus for a lot of us to start saying, something else is happening in the workplace. It doesn't happen in the office so much. It can happen in other places. Some agencies had facilitated remote work more than others, but a lot of them had started to do it. And it it was part of the genesis of programs that the government started putting in place that we called first freeze the footprint, then reduce the footprint, because as Dan noted, the utilization rate, the number of square feet per employee, was too high pre-hybrid work, really, by a lot. And then when we realized hybrid work could make a difference, we started to talk about different metrics for square feet per people, as did private corporations. And now post-COVID, we're going someplace else with very different.
Where are we going? I think maybe is the thing that seems to be like the multi-billion-dollar question. Like you got 375 million square feet of space that was underutilized pre-pandemic. Now I realize that there's some areas where there was probably overutilization or it's very busy and popular spaces, but let's say on the whole, generally underutilized. Particularly because you've got older buildings that maybe need retrofits and whatnot. Then you have this like macro event with the pandemic, and everyone goes home. And the infrastructure seems to be, from what I am hearing, seems to be in place for people to do telework, what was formerly called telework, or some type of hybrid work where they come in periodically. What happens to all of that space? And is this actually a catalyzing event for good? Or is this one of those circumstances where we're looking at inventory saying, oh my God, like there's so much sort of remnant stuff that we're never going to be able to get rid of because they're particular building types that only the government might be able to absorb. Curious, like how people should be thinking about the problem.
I'd say a couple things. One, there's some really big forces working on federal real estate right now. One, of course, the pandemic, it emptied out the buildings to a large extent. Two, that massive capital liability I was talking about. And really, even at a time when trillions of dollars are flying around Washington and being debated and negotiated, relatively small amount of that is landing on federal real estate in the draft bills that are out there. And when they do get funding, it's for very specialized space. It's like for border stations, land ports of entry, and courthouses, not typical office space. So even in an environment where literally trillions of dollars, there's never been so much federal spending, on the table than there is right now. GSA cannot get anywhere close to the capital it needs to renovate its office buildings. That's just a fact, a political fact.
Why does it need to renovate instead of just consolidate? Like why does the US federal government, and this is a particular issue that I don't know that I had completely wrapped my head around until you explained it, but like, why do you need capital to consolidate underutilized space?
Well, let me say two things. Yeah, go ahead. You go and then I'll.
Well,
the inventory is
Bob, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, okay. So two things. One is Dan notes the capital backlog. I mean, the government has built huge chunks of owned inventory, and really, one in the 1930s, the New Deal built a lot of buildings which we're still using. Then what some people in GSA refer to as the Great Society building boom, the 60s and 70s, the government expanded again, a lot of buildings. Hate to say it, but for all of us in the building industry, it was not a great period either for architecture or good construction. A lot of facades that, curtain walls that have issues. A lot of HVAC equipment that's reached the end of its useful life and that hasn't been replaced or seriously upgraded. Not everywhere, but the government's done a great job since the 70s on doing some things to reduce energy consumption per cubic foot, but still there are those capital issues out there. Second, if you're going to consolidate, and most people listening to this call or watching will have a sense of this, it is not, as one government official once said to us when we said we need money to help consolidate in government buildings, and he said, why don't you just push the desks closer together? You, Andrew, started to note that to make the best use of some of that space, you need to take down some walls. When you're renovating the HVAC, or even if it's relatively new, you got to change the ductwork. An open space works differently than a closed space where you used to have 200 square foot offices. But so there's a need for that kind of capital investment, even to consolidate, if you're going to do it in the government buildings. And some of them, let's just posit, because Dan will say it too, some of them could be readily adapted to a new kind of workspace, and some of them were built a long time ago and they probably don't work as well, no matter what you do to try to should try to make them work right as office.
I believe the quote was, "Tell Peck to shove the desks together." Like
that was I said, give us a fund, $50 million, $100 million. It's a huge inventory, just so we can start consolidating. We'll save a lot of money. And it was, yeah, why don't you just shove the desks closer together?
How much actually? Can you put it into perspective, Dan? We talked about this, I think, in a couple different conversations. What's the opportunity? We're talking about trillions of dollars in incremental spending. What's the opportunity in a fully rationalized, fully funded investment in consolidating federal real estate?
Yeah, well, I think that the reality is, right, you've got a large portfolio of owned buildings. I'm talking about the owned buildings here,
right?
That they're old. Like the average age is 50 years old. They're too big, oftentimes, in locations where there just isn't a demand anymore to fill the space, because utilization rates have changed when you layer in hybrid work and things like that. And they require easily. I mean, when the government does construction, you're talking at least $400 a foot to renovate a federal building. And then you got to furnish it and equip it again afterwards, because they're not going to use the same furniture and equipment that was in there before the whole building renovation. The math just doesn't pencil out. And then they're going to charge the tenant, $25 a foot because it's in Bangor, Maine. It makes no sense. Like you can't pencil that out. No rational company would spend $500 a foot to renovate a building and then charge $25 a foot in rent, or $20 a foot in rent. It just wouldn't happen. And that's what the federal government is facing in a lot of its inventory, because of where it's located. And they don't have the demand for the entire building. It's got massive capital liabilities. But the challenge is they have a positive net operating income this year in that building. And so they don't want to let it go. But they need to pivot from buildings like that. And frankly, they need to dispose a large portion of the owned inventory, because the demand just isn't there. And the financial value proposition of renovating many of those buildings also is not there. The math doesn't work. They're not going to get a return on that investment. And then and the limited capital. I mean, there are properties that the federal government has that it needs to hold on to. And if it's going to hold on to them, it needs to keep them in decent condition. It needs to make a return on that investment. The whole financial system of GSA is based upon that premise, right? That it generates a return on its capital. It has a positive net operating income. The whole system falls apart if it doesn't have that. And given the change in demand, and there's massive uncertainty as to what that demand is really going to look like 5 years from now. But I think everyone can say the demand is going to be less. It's hard to say how much less and exactly where it will be less, but the portfolio is too big now, and the government's got to start. They got to start contracting on that own portfolio, because the capital they can't maintain it all. It's just not possible.
I think Dan just gave you part of the answer to one of your questions, which is, so what is the right number now when we come back from the pandemic? And I'll tell you, I work in a part of Gensler where we do a lot of consulting work on space occupancy for both the federal government, which is what I do most of my time on, spend my time on, but also for corporations. And, nobody has the answer to that right now. I mean, we have lots of surveys. Gensler just posted another survey, if you want to see it, on where companies think they're going. Some companies on the Fast 50, Fast 100 chart say they're actually going to expand. They expect to get more employment, and they may even expand space. But most people say they're going the other way. We don't know how. We don't know how many days a week people are coming in. We are, in some cases, having conversations with government agencies and others about, let's assume 50% of the people are going to be in on any given day. What does that mean? It means seat sharing, among other things. So that's one whole side of the demand side. On the supply side of the buildings, what Dan alluded to, sometimes you have to look area by area. So GSA does an asset management plan in a given metropolitan area. And what you may find, as Dan noted, you may find a federal building that's owned, that's been there for 50 years, say, that is underoccupied at present. You also have to look at the leased inventory. How many of my leases are going to expire in the next couple of years? Sometimes it's easier to consolidate back into the federal building if you can get a little bit of money to renovate it and let go of a lease. Sometimes, as Dan argues more than I do, we have a difference of opinion about it, but I think it has to be particularized to an area. Sometimes it would make sense to say, as I noted before, this is a historic federal building. It was wonderful as a small custom house in the 1930s. Maybe somebody would love to use it for a small museum downtown, and let's move the people out of there and put them in a lease. Or maybe it's a larger federal building which doesn't serve its cause anymore. You have this other problem. There are federal courthouses that are courthouses. There isn't a whole lot of private sector demand for a building that's, chopped up into a lot of courtrooms and judges' chambers. So that's an issue. And finally, I think we should address the fact, Dan, we often sort of note, you're right, the general renovating a federal building can be $400 a foot. And people on this call are saying, wow, that's a lot more than you usually spend renovating a Class B or even Class A office building. The government has security requirements that drive the costs. The government has energy requirements, at least so far, that are beyond what most private sector people do. And the government is considering that this owned building has lasted 100 years. We're going to make it last another 100 years. So the requirements drive the costs. That's something else that could be considered when we start to think about that. But certainly on security, it's very hard to tell federal people in a federal building which has that sign on it, which we know now makes it a little bit of something of a target. You're not going to tell people we're going to stint on the security costs. So
I'm reminded of I think a West Wing scene where they were talking about the $400 ashtray. It's a bit dated.
The $600 hammer that the Air Force bought, or the $600, the $1,200 toilet seat, and
but
there
was a reason. But there was some type of very specific reason.
There was a reason. The government had spec'd it in a way that you couldn't just go to Ace Hardware and pick up a freaking hammer and buy it.
So I want to talk about a little bit about the future. There was a comment made in sort of our last discussion about the purpose of these buildings. Excuse me, to facilitate certain types of work for sure, but also to recruit, top talent, and that particularly right now the federal government is struggling against or competing against folks like Google and other sort of fast-growing companies for talent, particularly when you're talking about cyber command or any type of high security function, particularly in cyber. Dan, you walked through a Bloomberg office, I believe, and had sort of a revelation. Can you explain what you experienced?
Yeah, so I was in London, and I was there with an agency that was looking at building a new headquarters, and security was a top concern, but also they play a large role in cyber threats, and so talent is a really important issue and a big challenge for the federal government. And so we toured the Bloomberg. Well, at the time had just opened in London, and it's a gorgeous building. If you ever have a chance to get a tour, jump at it. It's absolutely spectacular. In terms of being able to recruit the type of talent that they're looking for, it's a real plus. Good location, lots of amenities, a lot of collaborative space. The cost per foot, I'm sure, is quite high, but it was so well utilized, and they Bloomberg's a data company, right? I mean, a market data company. That's really where their bread and butter is, and so they had developed their systems there internally that allowed you to have such rich information about how the building was utilized. And it was built out in a very flexible way too, because I think flexibility is really important to them. And they can see what parts of the building for whatever reason, were underutilized, other parts perhaps overutilized, and they could quickly reconfigure to create more of what was in demand and less of what wasn't in demand. And when we did the math, it became clear they were spending less money per person than GSA was spending to house a typical federal employee. And you would never think that, right? You walk into this location, it's gorgeous, fabulous. You can tell it's a very expensive building. And you walk into a typical federal building, you don't get that feeling, right? I mean, there are some federal buildings, some courthouses where you get that feeling for sure. But a typical federal office building, no, that's not the case.
Can I pick up on that?
More money per person.
Yeah, I can pick up. I'm sorry, Dan. Finish.
Go ahead, Bob.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Dan, one thing we should note, I mean, real estate is not just math. It is, there's an emotional response. Dan noted you walk into some federal buildings. I used to say this all the time, and your heart sinks. And quite honestly, you don't want a workforce where they walk into the office and their heart sinks. However, and I'm going to just say this, one reason it's hard to get money for federal buildings is when you talk to politicians, it's, well, you're going to spend money to make a work environment nicer for federal employees. And, we don't like federal employees. We don't like the federal government. We're certainly not going to make them feel good. And I happen to think that's a mistake, because you need federal employees to be productive, to like their jobs. You don't want to go down the vicious circle of punishing them for working for the federal government and having them return the favor by not giving good service, right? So, that's not smart. Second, as Dan noted, in the private sector, people much more regard the real estate as an opportunity to recruit and retain people. So let me put that together. One of the problems that you have reducing square footage in the federal government is a lot of federal employees, they don't have wonderful office space in the first place. They're holding on to every square foot because it's a status symbol. Quite honestly, I'm a lawyer by training. I can tell you lawyers for decades did the same thing. The more senior the partner you were, the more square footage you got in your space. Law firms are starting to break that mold too, because they figure out how much money they're paying for that status symbol, and they don't want to do it. I think for a Bloomberg, and I'll just say this about real estate and office design in general, they create a place in which my individual office space is not the only thing that makes me important. And as we say a lot at Gensler, so you get a little less me space, but more we space. The place feels like the whole, there's kind of a communal sense that I really like where I work.
There's some co-branding. I feel like there's some co-branding going on here. We got some we got some we coming out of Gensler and some we over.
Yeah. So it's I didn't want to. I forgot I was handing that right off to Dan. But there is a reason to, as we're going through this consolidation of space and reduction per person, which is a math issue. We need to remember we need to do it in a way that people feel like they got good space. By the way, I'll just note that I noticed in the chat that our friend John Vividelli from AgileQuest, who worked with us on the GSA building renovation, before you got there, Dan, but you got to go there. We went from, I think, 2,400 people assigned to 1800 F Street, the headquarters, to 4,500. We had badging data showing how much the space had been utilized. This is like 2011 or so, are those numbers. The interesting thing when GSA came back into the building, so there were all these people assigned, you can still go through and find, because AgileQuest did, we had seat reservations, that there's still less than 50% utilization of the seats. And this is pre-COVID. It just tells you somewhere how deeply we could go in reducing space.
So I want to talk about, sorry, Dan, go ahead. And then we'll.
I was just going to say, so we added 2,000 more people to the building when I was there.
Yeah, I mean, that was part of our original plan. We dumped 4 major leases in the Washington area. I mean,
but I would say and I come from more the, fiscally conservative side of the political spectrum. And just picking up on what Bob said earlier, right? My proposition was, we're going to trade quantity for quality. And so less space, higher quality, because frankly, that's what you need. I mean, everything that Bob was saying about, attracting and retaining the right type of people to work in the government, that's a real issue. It's a real problem. And, frankly, most federal buildings, talent's going to walk in and do a 180 and walk right out. Right? They just don't see themselves there. And that needs to change. And you layer on top of that, the government's actually spending more money per person because they've got so much poor quality space. The key is trading quantity for quality. That's really what the future is gonna demand, frankly.
Yeah, it's a good way to say it. Yeah.
I want to talk about hope for a second, if that's all right. Someone once told me there's not much I can do with hope, but I like plans or something like that. I can't remember the quote. I think maybe the question that I have is like, what is there, provided sort of the right amount of effort goes into, say, creating a future that you're excited about, or the U.S. federal government is excited about, or the taxpayers are excited about. What are you hopeful about? I mean, at least in our experience, we found like deeply thoughtful, super creative folks working inside GSA, actively trying to work this problem. And so I'm just curious, like, what are the areas for hope? Like, where is there opportunity, and where are you seeing really good work coming out of?
Yeah, I'll just note again, pre-COVID, and even before we renovated the space in the entire GSA building, we ran a pilot space on what had been an added annex on the 7th floor of the building. Tore out all the walls, got with different furniture manufacturers, tried different kinds of systems, furniture, and eventually had other federal agencies touring the space to see how this could work. And it wasn't just a demo. We actually moved a unit in there. They worked. People could ask people how this worked. I think the COVID has loosened up, as I noted before. There are some federal agencies, I don't want to be Pollyannish about this, where even today it's hard to get them to embrace what's going on and to think smartly about what's happening. But we're seeing an awful lot more agencies cooperating with what I think you're right to say was always some creative thinking at GSA about how office space can get used. And I think there's I think a lot of agencies are going to now think, how can I use my space differently? Is the space I'm in the right kind of space? And one other thing, we're in a period where there's going to be some transition while people try to figure out, what does the new office look like? And that raises a whole host of other issues. For example, as the lease comes up, you got a 250,000 square foot lease, it's coming up for renewal. Do you renew it for 10 years? Do you renew it for only 5 years? I'll just give Dan.
Well, can we actually
put the people in? Do you put the people in WeWork for a couple of years and see what works out? That's all of those are sort of interesting options that people are going to have.
Well, just a staggering stat. I don't know if we've covered it already on this call, but I believe, from what I understand, of the 8,000 leases that GSA has, or that the U.S. federal government has, half are expiring in the next 5 years. Is that right, Dan?
Yeah, roughly. I mean, it's a little bit less now, but they've got, I think, around 90 million square feet expiring in the next 4 to 5 years. So it's a lot of space. And then they also have, of course, I think a bigger problem with the owned portfolio. But going back to your question about hope, I'm actually pretty hopeful, right? I'm a firm believer in win-win situations. And you just got these big forces working right now. You've got telework that was forced upon every agency. And so they know it can work for a lot of functions. That was not the case pre-COVID. Also, during COVID, it forced agencies to buy mobile technology. When I was at GSA, we were literally buying tens of thousands of laptops and mobile devices every month in the beginning of the pandemic for agencies that had desktop computers and file cabinets and a bunch of paper, and they couldn't get anything done. So this massive investment has been made in the ability to do remote work. You've got federal employees who aren't super excited about coming back 5 days a week, and I wouldn't discount that. Unions are alive and well in the federal government, and they're negotiating for more telework. You've got an old aging inventory and no capital to really do anything. You put all that together, change, and plus a need for, particularly tech talent and an aging federal workforce. I mean, all that comes together. It creates a huge opportunity to have real estate serve the mission in terms of getting the right people to work, creating the right environment, and also lowering costs, because it can be a lot smaller, much higher quality. I mean, I think there's a real win-win opportunity there.
Yeah.
So I think the future is bright. It'll be smaller, but
Yeah.
it'll be nicer.
Small is beautiful. Dan is absolutely right, by the way. Federal employee unions used to, when we would say, your workstation and office standards are higher than the comparable space in the private sector. I mean, they would fight really hard to keep those numbers because, like I said, space was a status symbol. And now it's flipped. And we'd say, well, you could have people telework. They say, we don't want to telework. And now they're fighting for telework and fighting for a different kind of office style. And I think that's a hopeful sign. I think the idea that your square footage is some sign of how important you are is going away. I do think that, as Dan said, I hope we can trade the quantity for quality so that people get a different kind of a space that works better for the kind of work that they're going to be able to do in the future. I want to be optimistic that we'll be able to get that kind of approval from the budget control people in the federal government and the Congress. But hopefully, I'll just say this. I'm not so hopeful. I don't think we will see yoga rooms being put in federal buildings like we sometimes see in private sector organizations. It's probably a bridge too far. But some kinds of amenities that make people feel good about work and give them a break once in a while is probably in the offing.
Also, yoga is a place of mind anyway,
Yeah.
so I think you can still bring it into.
You can do it. You can do it at your workstation.
Bring the mat.
Right.
So I went in our last couple minutes. By the way, if anybody has any questions, please toss them in the Q&A. That is a little bit separate from the chat, by the way, just as an FYI. We're going to wrap in just a couple minutes. I was actually hoping we could maybe shift away from federal government for a second and talk instead about broader industry. You all sit in two very interesting spots. One sort of as one of the largest sort of sublease, and I can't remember the stat in New York City, but it's a pretty colossal portfolio that is provided to end customers who want to use space. What were the numbers, Dan?
Yeah, in Manhattan, WeWork controls about 1% of the office space in Manhattan.
And then Bob, Gensler as sort of like both a design organization and sort of sits in this very interesting space, collecting data and feedback from people about what is actually happening and what may actually happen. If there's anybody who has a crystal ball, it's probably Gensler on like what's going to happen in workplace. So I guess my question is, what does the future for all physical space look like? Are we thinking like, and I realize it's a distribution curve, you're going to have the Goldman Sachs, everybody must be in, you're going to have the GitLabs and other organizations that are, you could be called, wholly remote, but sort of the area under the curve, more hotel, less ownership, what's the 3 days a week? Like what is sort of the future of space?
I still think it's hard to have a crystal ball totally about how it ends up. Like how many days a week do people want to stay home? But I'll just say this. All of the surveying that everybody does, that we've done, that some of the consulting firms have done, indicates that people miss a couple things about being in the office, but only a couple of things. One, the opportunity to collaborate face to face. So we see, office space being more centered around meeting space and options for meeting. As an ancillary, there's an ancillary side to that. If I come into the office and I got 2 meetings, I still need a place to get my work done, and people are going to be interested in doing that. That's one thing. Second, I think it's quite clear that that organizations want their people to have some physical tie and an opportunity to get together, because that's what it creates engagement better than just having Zoom calls with your colleagues.
Well,
And
it creates
I think
trust. It creates trust. Like you're much more likely to be able to feel a sense of, a higher trust environment when you've got non-grid squares as something to relate to.
Yeah, absolutely. Otherwise, you're just, and I think some of the tech firms in California found this years ago, that if nobody ever comes together, you're just an independent contractor. And if I'm working for, say, Google today, I can go work for Amazon tomorrow. I don't have any, great feeling for the organization. And that's something that we want, that people want to tie themselves together.
I want to push back on this. And I know that I'm interrupting you like multiple times. I apologize. But I actually, as someone who works at an organization that has been distributed for a mix of co-located and distributed for the last 7 years, we're not quite Google. We don't have 144,000 people, but we do have 144, and we're operating in like 6 countries, and there's offices in like 3 particular areas, and then 16 states or something like that. I would say that it's probably maybe a bit too far to say that it feels like it's just sort of an independent contractor, like sort of logging in. But I can say that like getting teams together has a profound impact on, culture. They just don't necessarily need to be in the same place all the time.
Right. There is, however, I don't want to debate it too much, because I still feel really tied to Gensler, and I've been home for a year and a half. So, I've started to go into the office. It's just that the surveys show that people miss that. And interestingly, just one thing that our most recent surveys have shown is that young people, I'm clearly not one of them, miss the opportunity to be mentored and coached and to be seen by their colleagues that happens when you're there regularly. At least, maybe, Andrew, it's a difference. Maybe in large organizations, you need that more than in smaller ones where you can create the bond. I don't know. I think all of that remains to be seen too. And I take your point that maybe we're just sort of, I'm also maybe just going on inertia that that's the way we've always thought about how you tie people to an organization. But that's something else that remains to be seen. It all does say that the offices could be really different, right?
Well, I mean, I think also there's a pretty valid argument to be made that like once you're a sufficiently large organization, generally, call it greater than 3 floors for a single organization, you're running a distributed team anyway. You're just unwilling to admit it, And so I think like figuring out how to facilitate in person, I totally agree with your point, which is like you want teams to trust one another. There's certain types of work you just can't do, distributed. But man, like the world is like being forced to reconcile with or wrestle with what does it mean to actually not be in the same place, and can we do the same work? Because the federal government kept on operating, which is nuts.
And there are quite honestly, there are huge advantages. It used to be if you couldn't get everybody together at the same time in a conference room, right? You said, oh, we can't have this meeting. And meanwhile, you might not be able to do it because you're across town and you're in an Uber, Lyft, or taxi on your way back. Anyway, now you can get people that you would never have, we go, it's not a great thing. You can go meeting to meeting to meeting and get more people together than you could have otherwise. That's probably a plus.
Yeah, I guess I would just jump and say that I think what all this says, right, in the future, to your original question, Andrew, the future has a lot of uncertainty to it. Physical space is really important to organizations, but it's going to vary in time and place and by function. But it's important, and I think we're starting to see just how important it is, even 18 months into this pandemic. I know at WeWork, we have some customers that literally they've announced they're going a fully remote corporation. So what they do, they came to WeWork to buy what we call our all access pass. So it's the ability for people to come into office spaces kind of on demand, because they still, even as an all remote company, they need places to get together and they want to have that opportunity. In a way, uncertainty really is what we're staring at for the near term and probably for several years going forward, right? As to what the demand is going to look like. And the solution to uncertainty really is flexibility. And that's where you see like a change in commercial real estate in general. And this was happening, frankly, before the pandemic, but it's getting accelerated by the pandemic.
Mhm.
You know, traditionally, ownership and traditional leases are really your only solution to meeting housing requirements. And then this industry of flexible workspace started to develop, which creates tremendous flexibility in meeting those requirements. And it allows a portfolio of properties that are meeting a real estate requirement to have a different mix. A smaller ownership section, a portion of the portfolio that is more traditional leased, and then you've got a percentage of your portfolio. It just isn't that certain anymore. And flex space, was the fastest growing sector of the commercial office space pre-pandemic, and it's probably going to come out of the pandemic with a similar trajectory for those reasons, because flexibility is what you need to deal with uncertainty, and there's just more uncertainty now.
We all talk as, to some extent, and we've said this, but I want to say explicitly, so we all talk of the pandemic as if it's this cataclysmic change in the way office happens, and yet, it's really accelerated some trends that we saw before. And whether it's right or wrong, the real estate industry for a very long time, when architects and designers would go to create a space, you'd start asking people, well, I need to create a program. And when at the end of the day, Dan, I say this to government agencies all the time, so you've made us provide a seat for every single person in your organization. There are two things we know. One is they won't be in the office every day. So we just created a seat that probably won't get used so much. Second, 18 months from now, when the space gets built out, you will have changed your organization and you will have made us design a space that hardwired an organization chart that you developed 3 years ago. And then everybody will move in, someone will say, oh, that branch got consolidated with another one, or we abolished that branch, or our mission changed and something. So to go back to what Dan was saying, flexibility in office space is something we've been talking about for a long time. The more flexible you can make it, the more you can future-proof it, so that as things change, as organizations change, it'll change with you with the minimum amount of cost and disruption. The difference now is that we're not just talking about the change in your organization chart, who's coming in, who isn't, but there may be totally different ways of working 3 years from now. And if you're building out space right now, you've got to try to figure out a way to make it as flexible as possible so that it can adapt. And real estate isn't like widgets. You can't, or an iPhone, you can't come out with a new model every year. You lock yourself in, WeWork provides an alternative. Once you lock yourself into a 10-year lease, you're locked into a 10-year lease. Once you built a building that's supposed to last 100 years, you're locked into a lot of space.
Yeah, so you need flexibility like in that building, like Bob's talking about the design, the layout of it, similarly to what I was describing with the Bloomberg's facility in London. Tremendous flexibility built into the building itself, but it's also flexibility within a portfolio. That 100% of your assets in a portfolio aren't those 100-year owned buildings. If that's what your portfolio looks like, you have the most inflexible portfolio in the world. I guarantee you it's not going to be what you need. Right. And there's also flexibility in location. So it's the asset itself, the layout, it's the terms, and then it's also location because things change.
So you both work in really interesting space. You both have worked in really interesting space. If folks want to learn more about some of the data that's coming out of Gensler, Bob, or some of the offerings that WeWork has, best place for them to kind of follow up with you all?
I'm Bob_Peck at Gensler.com, or you can just go to our website, Gensler.com, and you'll see right on the front, you'll see some of our research.
Yeah, likewise, WeWork.com is the easy landing place to go. And I'm just Daniel.Mathews with one T, and that's what will mess everybody up, at WeWork.com.
You both are really, really great to hang out with. I hope we can do this again. And I appreciate you all making as much time as you have. To everyone who attended and to the folks that are sort of watching the recording, I guess, thanks so much for spending some time with us, and we'll be back soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.